Hi, I'm Deanna Joe, and welcome to my channel, Responsible Faith. Today, I have a very special guest with me. She's the author of a blog called Surviving Church and Childhood. And welcome, Debbie.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad you're here too. I just am going to get you to share your story here. You have a very interesting story, and I think it's one that needs to be heard. It's an important story. And so I guess the best place to start would be at the beginning. I know we have a shared background in the United Pentecostal Church. How did you get into the UPC? And then maybe expand on that and share kind of what that was like for you.
Okay. Well, my mother's family was Assemblies of God, and she came from a very charismatic and also conservative Assemblies of God church. Really, for my mother, the only difference between the Assemblies of God and the UPC was baptism. That was the only thing that was a really big hurdle for her and also her family to get over. So my mother had pretty much been taking me to Assemblies of God churches or Church of God churches pretty much since birth. I was dedicated in an Assemblies of God church, and she just could never find a church that she really felt comfortable in. Because my mother grew up in this very charismatic environment with very lively services, when she would go to many of these churches, they just felt dead to her.
Right.
That was the way she would describe it. And so we were often church hopping up until about the age of 7. My mom did a lot of church hopping. And someone came to our door one day and invited us to ride the Sunday school bus to our local UPC church.
Okay.
And my mother very commonly would hide from people when they knocked on the door, because we had a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses and stuff that would come to our door, and she didn't want to talk to them. So after spending a lot of time hiding from these people and not answering the door when they would come around on Saturdays, one day she finally answered the door and talked to the young woman who was there and said, sure, we would go. And so we rode the Sunday school bus to service. And my mother loved it. She loved it. She loved it. She loved it. The problem was that the baptism thing was a really big problem for her family. They were very upset with her for attending. They did not consider my subsequent baptism to be valid.
Right.
And so it really caused a rift in my mom's family, and my mom's family had lots of rifts already. So this just kind of further distanced my mother and I from the rest of her extended family. So I was about 7.
Okay.
When we started coming. Originally, we rode the Sunday school bus, but then as my mom started to attend Sunday evening services and Thursday evening services, then, we would drive. So yeah, that's how and for me at that age, it didn't really seem any different from the other churches that we had gone to. Like, I guess I wasn't super aware of the holiness standards when I was that young. Like, It didn't click into my head, oh, these women all have long hair, or these women are all wearing skirts, until I got baptized at age 10. And then all of that sort of became really a big deal. And I really, started to notice what I needed to change about myself.
Right. Yeah, because there's expectations that go along with committing further.
Right. And I grew up in, my mother always expected me to wear a dress to church.
Okay.
So I always wore dresses to church. So it wasn't like I was, a kid that never wore dresses and suddenly I'm around all these people that wore dresses. Like, my mother always put me in a dress to go to church. So it just didn't seem that unusual.
So you and I have talked before, and you had mentioned doing Christian school. So It was the ACE program, which I have heard things about. I can't say many of them have been good.
Yeah, so it's accelerated Christian education.
Yes.
So I was baptized when I was 10 years old, had my salvation experience, and then about a year later, I was really having problems in public school, not with the academic part of it, but with bullying. When I was a kid, being half Mexican was an issue. So I wasn't really accepted by the Mexican kids and I wasn't really accepted by the white kids. And it didn't become an issue till middle school. And then I was literally getting like beaten up on a regular basis and called names and all kinds of stuff. So I actually went to my mother and said, you know, the church has this new school that at that point had maybe been running a year. And I said, would it be possible for me to go to the Christian school instead of going to public school? Because as it is, I had like maybe 3 skirts and I would have to rotate them constantly. And of course, I was the freak that wore a skirt to school every day. And my 6th grade homeroom teacher kept track of the number of days in a row I wore a skirt and sort of made fun of me in that way. So it would
you were getting bullied by your teachers too.
Yeah, it would be easier to go to the Christian school because I'd wear a uniform and I wouldn't have to worry about looking different than everyone else did. And my mother would have been fine with me wearing pants. I would not wear pants. I was like, no, I'm not going to go to hell over pants. So I'm going to wear a skirt every day.
No.
So I did. And so my mother said, okay. And I ended up, going to the school, which a lot of really bad things happened when I turned 11. So we moved away from all of the elementary school kids that I had gone to elementary school with into a different neighborhood, which meant that when I went to middle school, it was a different group of kids that I didn't know.
Okay, that's rough.
So that was hard. My parents got divorced when I was in the 5th grade, and I went through my salvation experience when I was 10, which all of that kind of led to me going to this Christian school, which I kind of view as like one of the worst things that happened to me. It was a very isolating experience. If you're familiar with A.C.E., you're kind of in a little office with like slats. At the point when I was attending, they were brand new at this. They did not know what they were doing. They had no teachers. Everyone that was working there was either a new minister or a youth pastor or someone like that. They had no idea how to educate or how to teach. And so we also didn't really have extracurriculars. We did have gym class. And we would go in the wintertime, we would go to a Salvation Army gym and take the Sunday school bus over there and have like an indoor gym class. And then in the spring and the fall, we would go to a neighboring park, which was awful for me because I had allergies. So I was like miserable the whole time. But,
I could sympathize.
Allergies and culottes and pantyhose and gym. It was the whole thing. So I went to the school and I was leaving elementary school. I was a really good student. Never struggled with any topic, was always, at the top of my class. And then I went into this Christian school and I still did relatively well because I'm a self-starter and a self-motivator. But when I hit algebra, things got really bad.
Well, that's not an easy thing to teach yourself.
It isn't. I hate story problems to this day. Yes. They make no sense to me. I don't know why I need to know this stuff. Like, why do I care if a jet leaves at this time and another jet leaves at I don't care. What happened was, if you didn't finish the work that you were supposed to do for the day, you had to take it home. Otherwise, there really wasn't ever any homework unless you didn't finish your work. Well, my mother didn't know how to do algebra. So I would spend my entire evening in my room crying and erasing and trying to figure out problems. When I brought it back to school the next day, if I didn't finish it, which how would I finish it? I didn't know when I left for the day how to do it. So coming back, I wasn't going to know how to do it. I would get demerits. And then I would have to stay in for recess, which was the only break that we had from sitting in this tiny office.
So were they like cubicles?
Yeah.
Like,
well,
yeah.
I
Like
don't even know how to explain it. It's like if you're sitting at your desk and you've got just a couple of inches on either side of you and you've got slats sticking out. So you can't see the person on either side of you. All you can see is what's directly in front of you.
So that sounds kind of depressing.
It was very depressing. And I tend to be kind of kinesthetic, so I learn better through experience and doing things. So having to sit and read a booklet all day was so boring.
Yep.
And it was really distressing because there were subjects that I was taking that I was doing like college level work, or at least according to them, it was college level work. But then I was stuck back here on algebra and I couldn't like move ahead. And they couldn't help me. Like they couldn't figure out how to teach it to me. So it began this vicious cycle of me getting demerits, being punished basically for not understanding something. Which, you know, so I'm sitting in my office day after day after day after day. And when I say this went on for years, I'm not kidding. So basically in each unit, you have like 12 paces. And then when you get to the end, you have to take a test. And in our school, you had to get 80% or better to pass on to the next class, which was geometry. I was getting 74s and 76s and like really close, but not good enough. So they kept sending me back. And when you failed, you had to go back to the beginning and do it all over again.
Okay.
Well, every 12 paces was supposed to be a year's worth of work. So, you know, I was in this cycle of like really feeling demoralized, depressed, not understood. Like there was no compassion. There was no like, okay, this child has failed this test 3 times. Maybe we need to figure something else out for this child. Or maybe we need to make an executive decision and say 76 is okay.
Yeah.
Because like, I felt like the rules, just like the church I grew up in, the rules were very rigid and there was no compassion. There was no room for compromise or maybe saying this isn't working, let's try a different approach. It's like, this is what we're doing. This is how you have to do it. And I think that, you know, they really wanted this plug and play educational system. I don't think they were really all that interested in our education.
And what do you think the purpose was? Because I've heard so many people say how much misogyny is built into that ACE program. I've heard accusations that there are hints of racism in that ACE program and a whole lot of indoctrination.
There's they teach that the Loch Ness Monster is real.
Okay.
That's a fun fact. But there is racism and there is sexism and misogyny for sure. So there's that. But I think even beyond that, they really took being separate seriously. And so they wanted their children to be completely separate. We were not supposed to have friends outside of the church unless we were trying to win them to the Lord. And we never did anything with churches that weren't UPC. And even some of the churches around us that were UPC were kind of frowned upon because maybe their standards weren't as strict as our pastor's standards or whatever. Yes. So, you know, I think they really saw the world as a threat. They wanted their children to be separate.
Yeah.
And it didn't really matter to them if we were getting a subpar education. And they really didn't want to put that much time into making the school a good experience in teaching us how to think for ourselves, how to solve problems, how
Yeah.
to, or just giving us like a joyful childhood experience. Like that wasn't a concern. It was just like, because with ACE, I mean, you test the child, they tell you where to start them, and then you give them the stuff and they go.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to have to provide a good education or a well-rounded education. They just wanted something easy, I think, and they wanted to pull us out of public schools.
Which is quite short-sighted to, be that focused on the separation factor, because the reality is once you graduate, you have to go back out into the real world again and get a job, function with other people who are different from you.
Well, and the generation of kids that I went to school with, almost all of the boys ended up working for someone who had a business in the church. So it kind of reminded me a little bit of what you hear about with Mormons, where, the boys will go work for someone that has a business. It was very much like that. I mean, we were not ready. We were not college ready. We were not well suited for anything like that. And the girls didn't need to be educated, right? Because their role was to stay at home. I don't know that they ever precisely said this, but the message that I got was if you were going to go to school, you were going to go to Bible school as a woman, like if that's what you were going to do, and you were going there because you wanted to find a husband and you wanted to, perhaps find a husband that wanted to go into the ministry, if ministry was something you were interested in, or missions or whatever. But like, no one ever talked to me about what I wanted to do after school.
Right. And I mean, I laughed and you laughed at the whole women are just for being mothers. You and I are both mothers. We're not knocking that. I mean,
Yeah, I have 4.
I have 2. But it's an honorable thing to be a mother. But the concept that that's all you have for an option, that's the part that bugs us.
Well, yeah, I mean, I feel, and I've discussed this with a lot of survivors, I feel like I have so much lost opportunity. And
Yes.
I've had to take time to sort of grieve that lost opportunity. So right now I'm trying to write, and I feel very self-conscious, and I don't have a lot of confidence about my writing ability or even like my grammar ability, because I know that I didn't get the same education that everyone else did. I've done a lot to educate myself, to try to fill in those gaps, to try to learn the things that I didn't learn when I was in school. But, I mean, sometimes you don't know what you don't know, right? And so, yeah.
You had also mentioned that growing up in the church, there was like a culture of submission within that church in particular. I don't think it's special to that church, but it does seem like maybe that church had more than the average. And that ended up being a very unhealthy thing for you and for a lot of other young women.
Well, I've learned that there was a lot of sexual inappropriateness with young girls. And, again, after talking to many survivors, one of the things that has stood out to me is that a lot of us, we just were not, at the ages that we were abused, we were not equipped to understand the doctrine of submission. So I'm supposed to submit to my father.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, I'm supposed to submit to my husband and my pastor.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to listen to my Sunday school teacher if he's male. And so when a man comes along and is inappropriate with you, sometimes I think that young women have a hard time knowing where that line is.
Right.
Like, I'm supposed to submit to men ends up being the message. And an unsophisticated child mind isn't capable sometimes of understanding the nuances of who you're supposed to submit to and when. I don't think as a young woman, I knew how to say no to men in the church, period. I just didn't feel like it was my place. If a man said something, if a man asked me to do something, I would do it.
Well, I think just the general nature of being a young woman, I can't really speak to being a young man. I've never been one, but you're self-conscious, you're timid, you're awkward, and then I think just in general, and then to add that layer of submission on top of that, I think it muddies the water even more.
Well, and I think for me, so I was a little bit of a weird kid. I was really serious. I took sharing the gospel really seriously. So at some point, fairly soon after I joined the Christian school, I asked if there were any ministries that I could participate in. And the adults around me kind of looked at me and just like, what? I don't know what you're talking about. And at that point, we didn't have Bible quizzing yet. That's a whole nother thing. But I started going to nursing home ministry. And the nursing home ministries were all run by men. The men would come in and preach, usually new ministers that were kind of getting their feet wet, would go and work in the nursing home ministry. And so I would get rides with these young ministers to go participate in the nursing home ministry. So they were in charge. So there I was in a situation with a male who's in charge, who I'm supposed to do what they say.
Right.
And then I got involved with Sunday school bus ministry. And it was the same situation. We had a male bus captain and we had a male bus driver. And then here I was, and so on the Sunday school bus, the bus captain's in charge and I'm just there to kind of help him and do whatever he says. And then on Saturdays, we would go out and knock doors to remind kids about getting on the bus on Sunday, but also to try to get new kids to come on the bus. And I would go out with the bus captain and knock doors. So there I was again in a situation with a male who's in charge. And here I am, 11, 12 years old.
So it was just you and this bus captain. So it'd be you as an 11 or 12-year-old little girl and a grown man and nobody else?
Well, so on the Sunday school bus on Sunday mornings, we had a bus driver and a bus captain most of the time. So there would be two men and me.
Right.
And then for nursing home ministry, sometimes it would definitely in the car, it would be me and whatever man I was going with.
Right.
Sometimes other women would show up to help out and not. Sometimes other men would show up and sometimes it would be just me and that one person. Nursing home ministry was not a hot ministry that people wanted to go to.
It usually is.
It was hard to get help. As I got older, I became involved with in-campus ministry, even though I was a young teenager. And that ministry was more evenly balanced with males and females, so I wasn't like alone with a male.
What about on the Saturdays when you went out?
Alone with the bus captain, yeah.
That's interesting.
And there didn't seem to be a lot of concern, which, I mean, as the story goes on, I will tell you more, but there didn't seem to be a lot of concern with young women. It wasn't just me. Young women spending time with much older men.
Okay, and that was another point I wanted you to touch on, is that there was a prevalent issue in your church in particular of older men kind of like chasing younger girls, teenage girls. And I will say this, you're not the first person I've heard this from within the United Pentecostal Church, even currently, that I have heard of evangelists going around preaching and trolling the youth groups for a wife. And I mean, of course it depends on the church. Like, I've never been in a church where that was considered appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
But I have heard stories since I started my channel that have made me scratch my head and think, how does a church get to the point where nobody thinks this is weird?
Well, you know, it's funny because our church was considered pretty conservative. You know, no TVs. At that point, nobody had a TV. Now it's different now, but no slits, no clear nail polish, none of that stuff would have flown. We were not supposed to wear skirts that had zippers in the front because that was too much like pants. Yeah, so there was a whole thing. The holiness standards were pretty strict, but there was this real laxness around young girls and older men. So of course it happened to me. But I also witnessed other young girls have older men pursue them. And I mean, aside from the person who sexually assaulted me, I mean, I had other older men pursue me. I had a man who was in college when I was like 10, 11, 12, 13 years old for a while, who was constantly trying to give me gifts. And my mother really put the kibosh on it, but it was mostly because he was African American. And she had a real problem with that because our church did not believe in interracial marriage.
Yes.
And but yeah, I mean, he was constantly like, oh, it's your birthday. I have this new watch for you or whatever. And no one batted an eye or thought it was odd that this man in college is giving a 10, 11-year-old girl a present or trying to. I think a lot of churches do this where, you know, you stop and you shake hands with the person on either side of you and whatnot. And during that handshaking time, he would always come over and make sure he shook my hand and, you know, try to give me some candy or like a little present or something. And at first I was just kind of like, this is weird. But then when my mother found out, then it got really ugly because she was not going to have that. But
it wasn't because of the age difference. It was a race issue.
Right. Right. So I have a theory.
Okay.
I think that there was a large influx of college age men at one point, like a large influx. And there weren't a lot of college age women. And because you can't date outside the UPC, what are you going to do with all of these men? And I think that they started experimenting. Okay, so I'm 25 and I'm going to date this 18-year-old girl. Is anyone going to say anything? Okay, now I'm going to date a 16-year-old girl. Is anybody going to say anything? You know, and it just kind of became commonplace for these adult men to be hanging out with the youth group, which when I was a kid was like the older teens up to about 18. And then after that, you were with the older singles. These older men would come and hang out to minister in the youth group and, you know, yeah.
Gain access. And this is a problem I've actually had with the UPC. I don't know what the case is now, but I know when I was a teenager, the youth was sort of like conqueror's age. Does that sound familiar to you, where it was like 12 to 35? Like it was a pretty broad range there.
When I was young, it was 12, I think, to 21 or 18. It was a lot lower, but then over time it just started to expand. And so the age kind of kept moving up.
Right, because I can remember that being a broad age group, because I actually think I remember my mother saying something about that and saying, you know, a 30-year-old has no business hanging out with a bunch of teenagers.
Right.
Unless they're the youth pastors or they're in some capacity of leadership or ministry.
Well, I think, sadly, like, you know, a lot of these men gain access through ministry. They become the youth pastor. They start to work in the school. They teach your Sunday school class. They help out with the youth group, and that's how they gain access. Early on, things would happen and it would kind of raise an eyebrow with people. But over time, because no action was taken,
right, it became
then
normalized.
it became normalized. And I think that, in our church, our pastor kind of ruled with an iron fist. And so if he was seeing this stuff and he wasn't doing anything about it, well, then it must be okay. Because like I got called on the carpet for wearing clear nail polish and told, don't come back to school if you don't take that off. So like if they're gonna come down hard about something like that, then if they're not responding to this young man who's, taking a 12-year-old girl out after church every Sunday night, there must not be anything wrong with it.
It's almost like people check their brain at the door.
Yes. When I've talked to survivors that I know personally from the church I grew up in, we feel like in a lot of ways our parents abdicated their responsibility to parent and put it in the hands of the church.
Okay.
So if you went to your parent and you said this is happening, they would go to the pastor. And if the pastor said she's lying, that's not true, then that was it. Your parents were not going to advocate for you to the pastor. Whatever the pastor decided, whatever the pastor thought was true was what was true.
Because a lot of them view the pastor almost as God's mouthpiece. He's an extension of God himself. Oh, yeah. And so you're not going to cross that. This is just a child. Instead of realizing that their job was their children, not to submit to some man who,
and so if the church said children shouldn't, I don't know, whatever, pick anything. If the church said children shouldn't do that, the adults were not critically thinking and saying, well, I agree with the pastor on this, or I disagree with the pastor on this, or in our home, we're going to do this.
Right.
It was just like, the pastor said this, so this is what you're doing. And so it made it so that nothing is their fault.
Right.
So those of us who are abused, if you go to your parent and say, why didn't you stop it? Well, it's not their fault. Because, they're not the ones responsible for making the rules.
It gets pushed onto the church.
And the pastor can't be blamed for anything because he's God's anointed. He can't even be questioned.
Oh my goodness, no. Yes, I made a video about that mutilated verse that they take out of context and turn into something it's not meant to be, the touch not mine anointed verse. That verse has been used to manipulate and abuse people for years.
And it's terrible. I went to someone that, was from that church who was still in my life. And I said, how can you go there knowing what happened to me? Knowing the choices that the pastor made and how those choices were so destructive in my life, how can you go and sit under him as a pastor? And she just looked at me with all sincerity and said, it's not for me to question him.
It's exactly for her to question him.
And, this was a person who was advocating for me to come back to the church.
That's crazy.
And I'm just like, I could never, at that point I had young children. I was like, I could never put my young children in that environment, knowing what happened to me. How can you be okay with that?
Exactly. And I mean, they don't even have scripture to stand on for that. Scripture talks about false teachers, and you'll know them by their fruit. And it talks about us having discernment and to try the spirits and to see if they be of God. And so we're actually to take responsibility here and keep an eye on what's going on.
I feel like with false teachers and things like that, the way that our church took it was, well, the pastor will tell you who the false teacher is.
Well, what if
like, you don't have to worry about that. The pastor is going to tell you,
Everything about that's messed up.
So, yeah, I mean, there was a lot of, like, I don't have to think for myself because the pastor is going to tell me what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah.
And, I can just sit back here and let the church raise my children. And the goal was to have your daughter marry a good man, a Christian man at all costs. If God sent that man to her when she was 12, well, who am I to question God? He's a good man. He's a minister. He's whatever.
Yeah. That disgusts me as a female and as a mom. And I don't know.
Well, and there's an attitude of like, well, he gets up on the stage and leads the song service. Therefore, he's a godly man. Therefore, he can be trusted with my child.
Yeah. No.
Well, and I've often thought, like, how would I handle that if I was in that situation as a parent? And I think what I would say to that young man who was much older than my daughter is, I think it's really lovely that you have recognized how wonderful my daughter is. And I'm sure that you have nothing but good intentions. So once she's 18, if you're still single, I think it would be great, if the two of you got together.
Right.
But not now. She's 12.
You're a lot nicer than me. My thoughts of a grown man sniffing around an 11 or 12-year-old girl involve a shotgun and probably the police being called and the 5 o'clock news.
I'm passive aggressive, so I would be like, I'm sure a godly man like you
Yeah.
would not want to.
I feel like I'd probably go a little bit crazy and make the news,
The thing is that here's the other thing you have to understand is like in the congregation that I grew up in, everyone is so beaten down.
Right. I do understand that.
And sort of under the boot of the authority of the church. And so a lot of those people, I don't think, have a lot of fight in them left.
Yeah. Well, it's intentional.
Yes.
It's all about control.
And imagine how much harder that is to bear and navigate when you're a child.
Yeah. Yeah. And so in your case, you were sexually abused.
Yes.
Through that church. And so talk about that. How did that come about?
My mother never bought in 110%. So she was always kind of on the margins. And some of that has to do with the fact that the women in the church didn't treat her very well. I think if my mother had been treated better, she would have probably bought in. But my mother was looked down upon because she had been married to my father, who was a Mexican, and they didn't like that. And then my father, had lots of affairs. So then she got divorced, and then she was looked down for getting a divorce, even though the pastor had cleared her divorce because my father was an adulterer.
Right.
But she was still looked down upon. And then you add like poverty and, all of these things on top, and she was marginalized. So because of that, my mother didn't come all the time. Like she would feel guilty and, she'd come to a revival and she'd get filled with the Spirit again. And then she'd come for a while and then she'd kind of slip away. And so I was very pious and I wanted to be there whenever the doors were open. And my mother did not want to drive me whenever the doors were open. So I started to get rides from like lots of young couples in the church who I considered to be friends. Yeah. They were nice to me. They kind of took me under their wing. And at one point it was a Sunday morning. I was standing in a group of these young people and I said, and so I'm 11 at this point. So I'm in the 6th grade. I said, is it possible for anyone to give me a ride home? And almost immediately this, he was 29 at that point, your old man said, sure. I would be happy to give you a ride home. Well, I didn't really know him. I knew that he and his wife had recently joined the church. I knew that they had been married there. But I knew of him, but I didn't know him. And everyone in the group, they were all friends. He was part of that group. We're like, that's a great idea. You know, he doesn't live that far from your house.
Mm-hmm.
It would be really quick, like right down the road, because I lived like a straight couple miles down the road from the church. And so he said, sure. And because all the adults around me seemed okay with it and seemed to think it was a good idea, I felt safe.
Because you trusted those people.
Right.
Right.
I trusted their judgment as adults, as members of the church. So he gave me a ride home. He asked me if I wanted to get ice cream. So we went to Dairy Queen and we got ice cream. And then he said, you know, do you need to be home right away? Would you like to just go for a ride? My wife is working and I don't have anything to really do this afternoon and I'm kind of lonely. And I was a kid who was well acquainted with being alone and feeling lonely. And so I felt a lot of compassion for him. I also had parents who I kind of had to parent.
Yeah.
Neither of them were really equipped. So I was used to sort of feeling sympathy, pity, compassion for adults and trying to make things better for them.
Okay. Yeah.
So I came into this experience almost being like the perfect mark, right? And so I was like, oh, you know, I feel really bad for him. He's lonely. And no, I mean, I'm just going to go home and lay on the bed and listen to Amy Grant. So
Yeah.
sure. This was also a period of time in our house where we didn't always have electricity in the summer. My mother was dating someone and was kind of preoccupied. And so I was kind of left to my own devices most of the time. So I was like, sure, I'm eating ice cream. I'm happy. So it was a relief to not be at home.
Yeah.
Home was not a real happy place. So the very first time that I was alone with him in the car, he reached over and grabbed my hand and held my hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. And I remember just kind of looking straight ahead and thinking, well, this is weird.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole time he's doing it, he's just animated and charismatic and telling me stories and laughing. And so not acting creepy or odd, just that one little thing was off. But then I started to think about it and I was like, well, my dad still holds my hand sometimes. And maybe he's just, you know, trying to be like a father figure or like, you know, I don't know what I was thinking, but at the time I was just kind of like, well, this is weird, but whatever. And I tell people it's like being the frog in the boiling water, right? I kept getting deeper and deeper enmeshed in what he was doing and not knowing how to get out. And there was a lot of emotional manipulation that happened. He would tell me about his marriage, how unhappy he was, how sad he was, how lonely he was. It was a lot of like me feeling sorry for him and wanting to be his friend and kind of feeling like, well, I'm lonely too, and no one's paying attention to me. So I've got a friend, and this is nice. Here's a person who wants to pay attention to me. He wants to talk to me. He fed me. We didn't always have a ton of food when we didn't have electricity because we didn't have a refrigerator. So
Right.
my mother would keep like a cooler in the kitchen with a half gallon of milk and some bologna. And there were periods of time when she would go fishing for our dinner. So like we would have these like really bland fish patties that didn't like have anything with them. So like and the church wasn't doing anything to help us, by the way. Like,
Yeah.
you know, so, you know, it was a really sad time for me. I was very lonely. My parents were, you know, had been divorced about a year, and he took full advantage of that. He fed me, he talked to me, he listened to me. He told me his problems. It felt like a reciprocal relationship.
Right. He treated you like an equal.
He did. He did.
Yeah.
He really did. Then there was the other side,
Right.
right? Which I look back on it now and I think, it kind of just, it felt like it became the cost. I didn't want to stop spending time with him because I didn't want to lose my friend.
Right.
There was a warmth and an affection that came along with everything else that I wasn't getting at home at that period in my life. My mother was very preoccupied. Soon after, she got married. My stepdad was an alcoholic and very possessive of my mother. So she kind of just faded into the background of my life. And my dad was very unreliable. Sometimes he was around, sometimes he wasn't. And so here was this person who was kind of a constant, who I could depend on, who would do things like hold my hand. Well, when you're an 11-year-old child, you need parental affection. You need to feel accepted. And I wasn't getting that. And he took advantage of that, need of, needing to eat. It was pretty early on that he and his wife suggested to my mother that I should accompany him on his sales trips. They were day trips, they were not overnight trips, but all over Wisconsin, that I should accompany him to keep him company because he got really lonely on the road. And I didn't have much to do at home without electricity. There was, what are you going to do? I couldn't even listen to music. I would run out of batteries for my little tape player all the time. So it would get me out of the house, and I would be saving him from being lonely. Like both him and his wife kind of stole it as like I was doing this big favor for him. And so I started going on these trips, which meant that there were times when I was 6 or 8 hours alone in a car with this person out of the city that I grew up in, where no one knew us, where no one would question. And, it went on for a couple of years. He was 31 when I finally told my pastor. He did attempt to have intercourse with me, but it's so sad when I say this, but I was physically too small for him to have intercourse with.
Right, because you were just a little girl.
He was very frustrated by that and just kind of gave up eventually. But
and that point that scared you in spite of everything else that he had done.
Yeah,
there
were two incidents that happened pretty close together that scared me. The first one was he brought me to his house, which is something that he didn't really do very often. Okay. And he actually took me into a bedroom, which is something that he never did. And, took his clothes off. And that really scared me. I'm standing there. There's a completely naked man on a bed. I had never seen a completely naked man. Now, to go back, I mean, I had seen him with, his penis out because he had done that on pretty much every time I saw him. But I hadn't seen, here's a man on a bed, and that scared me. But I went along with it because what am I going to do? I didn't know what to do. And then the next time I saw him, he took me down into the basement of his house and tried to have intercourse with me. That was the last time that him and I interacted that way.
And at that point, for you, it didn't matter that you were potentially going to lose this connection with this person who was so kind to you otherwise.
Well, I don't even really, I'd like to say that, but I think that, so I worked in this little popcorn wagon that the church had, and we would go downtown and we would sell popcorn and soda and stuff like that to make money for the church. And there was a young woman, she was older than me, she was over 18, who I just blurted it out to one day while we were sitting in this popcorn wagon. Actually, we were sitting on the curb, and I don't know why. I don't know where that came from. It just sort of came out of me. I'm sure it had something to do with being afraid, right?
Oh, yeah.
But it just kind of came out of me. And to her credit, she was very calm. She said she asked me questions, but in an interested way, not in a condemning me way or saying I was a terrible person. She went home and told the minister and his wife, who were elders in our church, who she lived with. And the minister's wife told her, either she tells Pastor Grant or I tell Pastor Grant.
Okay.
And so, you know, this message gets relayed back to me. And I'm like, well, I guess he's going to find out either way. And me being the kind of kid I was, I went into the secretary's office and made an appointment with my pastor. And
That's so cute. And at that point, you were how old?
12.
12.
Or 12 or 13. I think I just turned 13 because it was like 2 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I went, he called me in and there was nobody else in the room.
Again, I like...
He tape recorded what I said. He asked me very sort of clinical questions and then just said, okay, I'll take care of it. And that was it.
He didn't call your mother. He didn't get your mother to come in with you.
He did not pray with me, which is what I would have expected. And he did not follow up with me.
So he never checked back in?
No.
Nothing.
What he did do was go home and talk about it in front of his family, though. So it got out among the young people because
he had kids.
With me. His son went to school with me. His older son was the youth pastor. So there was that. And then when my mother did find out, which she found out sort of through the grapevine, her response was to call me a hussy and get really angry with me. And it was like she was really angry for a while, but then it just kind of subsided and she never talked to me about it. No one ever talked to me about it. So I was just sort of left to try to navigate my own healing and all of my emotions that I had about this by myself. Like I would have thought that the pastor would have had his wife check in on me or, you know, the women in the church, because the thing is that the gentleman who molested me was subsequently within a couple of days caught with his wife's little sister.
Who was how old?
15.
And you say caught with, you mean?
In bed.
Yeah.
And so he called me and said, I'm leaving town, it's not your fault, and hung up. So I got no resolution with him. His wife pulled me down into the Sunday school room and told me I needed to repent and how could I do this to her. She thought she could trust me with her husband. And then kind of proceeded to loudly like speak in tongues and pray with me for my repentance and salvation and that whole thing. And I remember that night because I was terrified when she said she wanted to talk to me. Because I already felt so much shame.
Right.
I felt so bad. And I remember her just like speaking in tongues and praying so loudly. And I just sort of left my body. Like I couldn't cope and everything just went numb.
Yeah.
And, you know, I did that a lot when I was a kid in the church. I had to sort of dissociate in order to be able to cope.
Because it was too much.
And what I always like try to remind people of is that at least 12 couples would have been told by the pastor what happened to me. Because here's a man who's pretty prominent. He's up on the platform. He's playing music for every service. He's well known. You know, he hung out with all the ministers and everything. A man like that doesn't disappear from a church without the elders being told what's going on.
Right.
a 15-year-old girl doesn't disappear from a church and a school without that happening. And a woman doesn't have her husband just leave and go to a different state without all of the elders and everyone knowing. So at least 24 people, plus the pastor and his family, adults, knew what happened to me. Well, I mean, okay, so this woman loses her husband. I think it's pretty safe to say that all of the adults knew,
Yeah.
or at least had heard what was going on. And I can honestly say that no one at any point ever spoke to me about it, ever comforted me or checked in on me or asked me if I was doing okay. But what they did do is they gossiped. And that loving environment of feeling like I had these young adults who were my friends, who I was close to, that dried up. And so then I was really alone.
Yeah, and so you were 11 when it begun, about 13 when it ended, and you were labeled.
I was really treated like the church whore, is what I say.
Right.
And I was super aware of it, and it was made more difficult by the fact that I always tell people that I looked like a walking, like a Betty Boop, like if Betty Boop was in the UPC. So I had developed really early. I was really chesty, but I was like 95 pounds. So I had these like really large breasts and really small body. And so I already felt so self-conscious about my body and so uncomfortable. And our pastor preached so much about not causing your brother to fall into sin. And, that women needed to be shamefaced and they needed to be careful. And I really felt like I had caused this somehow, that my body at that time, I felt like this body that God gave me just by existing was a trap for men. And so it really damaged my self-esteem. And it made me try harder. I kept trying harder and trying harder and trying harder to be as holy as I could be, as careful as I could be. I became the Bible quiz, captain. I really wanted to know God. I really wanted to understand God. I really wanted to please him and live a godly life. I wanted to minister to people. But it was really difficult because as I was trying to do these things, I was constantly aware of how people viewed me.
Because of their knowledge of the abuse, and you had said that they had told stories about you.
Well, so I didn't actually find this out until about 2 months ago. I got reconnected with a woman who was one of those adult friends that I had when I was a kid. And she's out now, out of the church. And she told me that before I reported to the pastor that Steve and his wife had gone around and said, you need to stay away from Debbie because she's trying to seduce Steve and she might try to seduce your husband. What this friend of mine that I've reconnected with now said was, well, we didn't believe it because you were such a godly child. Like you were always trying to be a part of ministry and trying to, you were always dressed appropriately. Like you weren't one of those kids that was trying to like skirt the rules. And also these other adult men had been alone with me and none of them had had the experience of me trying to seduce them or trying to whatever. And so that brings up a whole nother question, because if his wife had been told that something was going on, why did she continue to allow him to be alone with me? Because he continued to be alone with me after they did that. So I don't know what the answer to that question is, but I think that he was trying to discredit me because he was probably concerned that I was going to say something.
Right. And that's common.
He had to have known those last 2 times that we interacted that he had scared me. I don't know how he could have not known. Because I can remember being next to him in the bed and being frozen. It's like my body was stiff as a board, and I had to sort of dissociate and go somewhere else in my mind to get through it. And he kept trying to encourage me and trying to get me to participate. And I was just sort of like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. And I'm sure he knew that he had maybe pushed too far.
And that this was going to come crumbling down.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he capitalized on your home life and your situation when he was grooming you, and then tried to discredit you when he felt like the whole thing was going to unravel on him.
Yeah.
And then it ended up not being you, the reason that he was run off from the church. It was.
Well, I mean, that's what I believe, because it happened really fast. So subsequently, I have heard so many stories coming out of that church of sexual abuse of children where the men don't get run off.
Right.
And so I believe that he was run off because the other girl that he abused, her parents weren't in the church at all. So that could be a really big problem.
Right. He had no control over the way those parents thought. So, of course, they're going to go to the police.
Right.
Or at least possibly.
Long story short, he ended up marrying his wife's sister. They got divorced and he ended up marrying her. And they actually pastor a church here in Wisconsin. It's not a UPC church, but it is a Oneness Pentecostal church.
Now, do they enjoy the approval and the right hand of fellowship of the UPC ministers around them?
Yes. It's actually been really interesting to watch what happened, because by the time I was 15 or 16 years old, I had already run into my abuser at family camp.
Oh, yeah.
Which was an awful experience. Terrible. And I was shocked that he was there. What I've heard since then, what I've discovered since then, is that he was basically attending another church. He was given a daughter work within the UPC, which you have to understand that my pastor during childhood was also the district superintendent.
Right.
And so he was given a daughter work and was going to the ministers' conferences and things here in the state. And then he just fell out of the UPC, and no one seems to know why. He was doing this daughter work, and then he just went independent, and nobody knows why. But since he's gone independent, he has had UPC ministers preach at his church, which is not in accordance with the UPC bylaws. People from the church I grew up with are friends with him on Facebook, and once my story came out and I started to question why these UPC ministers were preaching at his church and inviting him to preach at their church, given that he wasn't UPC, there were some pretty angry responses from people who were just like, well, I didn't know that he did that to her. Well, okay, but you knew he wasn't UPC, so still doesn't make sense to me, because, I don't know how it is everywhere else, but here in Wisconsin, my experience has been that if you're not UPC, they don't associate with you. It doesn't matter if you're a oneness Pentecostal who belongs to a different religion or to a different denomination. You have to be UPC. And
Okay.
so I've always been a little bit shocked that for some reason he is the exception to that rule.
Especially considering that the district superintendent at the time knew of a molestation accusation from one little girl, and that he slept with his wife's sister, which ended their marriage, and then he ended up marrying her, and he was still willing to.
Well, and let's be fair, she was 15 years old. And so from my perspective, like I don't know why he was ever allowed to have any kind of leadership position, especially given the fact that he at the very least was an adulterer and had divorced his wife, or his wife had divorced him and he had married someone else. I mean, within the UPC, when I was growing up, that was a big no-no. You didn't do that.
Although to call it adultery is ridiculous, because he was what, in his 30s and she was a 15-year-old little girl. I mean, that's not adultery.
Well, and he characterizes it now as adultery. He
Oh, I'm sure.
characterizes what happened with me as adultery. He has told people that he was chased, that he's been chased by women the whole time that he's been in the UPC, some young, some old. He's repented for his sin, and therefore, everything is okay.
When you went to him and told him, did he report this to the police?
No. From what I've heard through the grapevine, he told people that he did, but when I spoke with the police department, they said they had no record of anything ever being reported.
Well, and the fact that, I mean, did you ever have anybody come and talk to you about it? So there's a good chance that he never did report it, or at least somebody would have come to you and your mother.
Right. And so, no. And, Pastor Grant is not the pastor, the everyday pastor per se in the church now. He's sort of like the senior pastor, and his son is running the sort of everyday, details of the church. But they hide behind the statue that says that whatever is said in the confessional doesn't have to be reported. So we have a clergy loophole here in the state of Wisconsin. So that law was originally written for the Catholic Church, and it was like, if you go into confession and you confess something, the priest doesn't have to report it. Well, they hide behind that. So now what they say, what their slippery words are, is we report everything that we are required by law to report.
Right.
What frustrates me about this when I look at it is I don't care what the law said he should do. He was my shepherd. He was my pastor. I went to his church from about age 7 to about age 17. I attended their school. I was the Bible quiz captain. I worked in all these ministries. He was the highest authority in my life. I had no access to police officers. I wouldn't have known how to get a hold of one. I had no access to teachers who weren't in the school, in the Christian school. Like, he was the highest authority in my life. And I went to him as that authority figure and told him what was happening to me. And he did nothing to help me. He just let me spin out. And so for me, I have to ask, like, where is your Christ-like compassion? Where is your love? You would think that he would sit down with me and at least check in and say, are you doing okay?